Okay, so for the rest of the afternoon, we're going to get 3 additional perspectives on measuring success. First, we have Kristin Voorhees from Fish and Wildlife Service, who also spoke at the Science Roundtable yesterday, but talking a little bit more about how the Fish and Wildlife Service is considering measuring conservation. Kristen is a Maryland native who moved to Chicago in 2009 to earn her PhD at the University of Chicago in evolutionary biology. After completing her degree, she began work at the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service as a fish and wildlife biologist in the Chicago Ecological Services Field Office. And Kristen is currently working on the National Species Status Assessment team for the monarch, which she spoke about a little bit yesterday, and will continue to share some additional analysis. So thanks, Kristen.
All right, good afternoon. So we talked a little bit yesterday about the full context for the monarch regulatory landscape right now, and today I'm giving you just a little bit more specifics on how we want the actions that you guys are implementing to plug in to that context. So it's called, we're calling it our Conservation Efforts Database, and some of you may already be familiar with this type of action. It happened with sage grouse, where efforts were collected prior to the listing decision in order to be able to account for habitat protection and habitat availability going forward for the species. And in the sage grouse's example, that was able to help preclude the listing. And so similarly with monarch, we want to be able to collect that type of information from everyone doing the types of conservation efforts we're talking about here today. So this is a slide that Louise showed yesterday. I just changed that middle word from peace to CED. So she talked about how do we use the policy for evaluating conservation efforts. Here I'm saying where do we use the conservation efforts database? So collecting those efforts directly from individuals like yourselves, and how does that fit into our species status assessment? So we are collecting information on species needs, on the landscape and their current condition, but also their future condition. And so those are both places where ongoing conservation efforts can be included. For the current condition, if we learn more about what's on the ground, baseline conditions, we can include that into the current status of the species. But for the future condition, there are a lot of scenarios we can run that will include efforts that will be on the ground in the future and are being created at this moment, but may not be affecting the population directly this year or next year, but will affect the population in the years to come. So just to get a little bit more into detail about the actual analysis that's going to use this in our species status assessment, I'm going to go back to one of the R's I presented on our panel yesterday morning called Resiliency. Louise also mentioned this. So in defining the monarch's viability going forward in time, and viability being its ability to persist in the wild in the face of existing threats, we defined an R called Resiliency. This is the principle that the species can withstand normal fluctuations in its environment over time, good years, bad years. This is demonstrated through the demography of the species. So I have that question here, how well can the species withstand natural fluctuations in the environment? And that's also while persisting in the midst of the threats it faces. So this is exactly where the information will go in from our conservation efforts database. It will be a part of other information. Here's your spaghetti diagram. But bolded are the CED and habitat gain. So I presented this a little bit yesterday, but just to summarize, there's a number of inputs all the way to your far left into a number of influences that we believe affect the monarch population that are then used in a monarch population viability model. So the model is population size over time, given some change in that population size, and then that gives us a level of probability of persistence, or probability of extinction is another way to think of it. And so habitat gain is one of those influences. And so by you putting information into the conservation efforts database, we're actually tallying habitat gain on the landscape, and that's actually going to influence our population size and growth rate, which is that change per year. There's another box that just lightly showed up there, which is pesticides. So when people are entering efforts into our database, we do ask that they provide information about threats addressed. And so some areas will be able to give us information about pesticides used or not used, but this is not something that we expect everybody will be able to provide. It's just another opportunity possibly in our analysis for information to be added. So the purpose, as I mentioned already, for the Conservation Effort Database is to capture high-level monarch conservation plans, but more specifically formalize conservation efforts. And then these efforts will inform our listing decision by that model I just presented, the resiliency model and our species status assessment, as well as through the peace policy, the policy for evaluating conservation efforts that Louise talked about yesterday. And so at the stage of our decision in June 2019, everything that you guys have been doing can be on the table for the decision makers if it's been included in our database, and also we've been able to incorporate it into our analyses through our population model. So if it's hard to read, just take my word for it, but this will be a really user-friendly interface online. Up there at the top you see it says Tess Choi, one of our database builders, Steve Choi, used this as an example of how he would enter data. And this is taken from the Sage Grouse database. So our monarch database is being built off of that database. We are being advised by the folks who designed that for what kind of information is easiest to incorporate and user-friendly. But when you get to the site, you will create a profile, your own user profile, where you'll enter the type of activity you're doing, as well as does this mouse work on here? Yeah. Here you see like threats addressed, and so this is a list of different threats identified for the sage grouse, and we will have a list of threats identified for monarchs, and you can check off whether your effort is addressing those threats if you're aware of them. And then down here you may have other collaborators on your project. You may have information about your plan that you want to make sure that we know, and you don't have all this information, that's okay too, but this will be specific to your profile to enter in and also to update on your plan. Similarly, if you're already collecting a lot of data, which people in this room are, or there are other databases that exist, you can batch upload your data. So this is just a screenshot of the site where you would upload a data file. And the way this will work is still being worked out. We've talked a lot about databases for other reasons here today. The Fish and Wildlife Service is having conversations with those different groups to make sure that our databases can talk to one another, have similar fields, but that would make this batch upload possible. And at the very least, the Fish and Wildlife Service could send a spreadsheet to the partner that would have matching fields, and that partner could then quickly populate it using a program instead of having to one by one enter your efforts. So if you have a large number of efforts, you would just batch upload that. And then finally, this is actually spatial data. So is the mouse up there? Yeah, so you can see up here, these are WAFWA zones, so the Western Association for Fish and Wildlife Areas. We have identified areas for the monarch. You've seen the different prioritization maps. There will be spatial data like this that will allow you to characterize where your effort is happening. And if you'd like, you could upload shape files and sort of identify, how many states and regions are affected. This is going to be hopefully very useful for one of the outcomes or products we want from this database, which would be a map that you could look at after you've entered your data and your efforts to see what's going on near you, or to see what you are being able to do on the landscape for monarchs. And yes, finally, this is the page about implementation information. So this gets more into the details of the peace policy that Louise mentioned, where some efforts will be formalized and will have certain protections and certain assurances and or easements or things like that, but they will also be up here planned, in progress, or completed, and that will help us to parse out what is ongoing or what's already happened that we didn't know about and what will happen in the future. So as I mentioned, all of these things are being designed currently. So these are sage grouse examples. They will look a little different from monarchs, but I'm really here to show you that as an example so that we can have a conversation. You can let myself know, or Louise, what you think might actually be feasible to share with the Fish and Wildlife Service in terms of your habitat that you have. I think currently we expect maybe folks can provide a number of acres that they're putting habitat out on, but there may be more detailed information you would like to provide. Well, we have this type of nectar quality or habitat quality, but we've talked a lot about quality metrics here, so I know that those can vary, and not everybody has the ability to get those data. So we are open to hearing that, because we're still figuring out exactly what fields we want to include so that all the efforts that are on the ground can be included in this database. So that's all I have. Another comment I need to make, though, is that the Fish and Wildlife Service is reaching out specifically to partners in the different sectors, and so there may be a separate contact for some of you in your particular sector from the Fish and Wildlife Service to have one-on-one sort of directed conversation about this to make sure it's compatible with what you're doing. Thank you. I'll take questions.